Greenland, land of snow and ice, kind of like Cleveland, land of snow and ice lately. This is me in front of a frozen Lake Erie and downtown Cleveland there in the background. But we're talking about Greenland, all right? The Greenland that's not so green, right? It's icy. However, was green in the past. I've talked in the past about how there's a really interesting fossil site at the very northern tip of Greenland where there's a bunch of mammoths that are preserved up there, along with a whole bunch of other fauna and a forest. Of course, that doesn't exist today. It's under a whole mound of ice, and most of Greenland is underneath ice. There's something else that's underneath ice, and that is some World War II planes called the Lost Squadron. It's a series of planes that landed on a glacier on the southern tip of Greenland back in 1942 in a snowstorm. And many, many years later, those planes were finally found again under 260 feet of ice. Now, that story of the Lost Squadron and the planes that are now underneath the ice has been spun into a favorite talking point by young Earth creationists. Hence, the episode of Critiquing Creationism we have here in front of us today. But what if I told you, actually, would you be surprised if I told you that this story doesn't hold up to scrutiny? Yes, there are bombers 260 feet underneath the ice. Really amazing. Yes, there is a bunch of ice that accumulated on top of them over a very short period of time. But is this evidence that the entire ice cap could have formed in less than 4,000 years? Is this evidence that directs us to a young Earth? I don't think so. And one of the major reasons why is because of volcanoes. The story of volcanic ash is the piece of information that's left out of the creationist story as they talk about ice cores in Greenland. We'll get to that at the end, but first, let me tell why the whole Lost Squadron evidence of a young Earth kind of bothers me more than maybe a lot of other posts, and I've been seeing this thing a lot on social media lately. So let's talk a little bit about Ken Ham, Creation Ministries International, the Lost Squadron, the amount of ice that accumulates in Greenland, and then eventually talk about the ice cores and how young Earth creationists misread those. We've got all that coming up next. Okay, let's talk about the origins of this Lost Squadron young Earth creationist argument. It goes all the way back to 1992. And that's one of the things that maybe upsets me the most is the fact that this has been going on for 30 years. And critics such as myself have pointed out obvious errors. And for the most part, creationists have ignored those and continue to pummel their followers with this simplified story that doesn't represent the reality of the situation. Way back in 1992, Larry Vardman, a prominent young Earth creationist, wrote an article suggesting that the burial depth of the Lost Squadron disproves the scientific understanding of ice core dating. Let's just read this quote here from Impact Magazine. Ice cores are claimed to have had as many as 135,000 annual layers. Yet the airplanes of the Lost Squadron were buried under 263 feet of ice in just 48 years, which becomes about, well, that's about 5.5 feet a year. This contradicts, in his mind, the presumption that the wafer-thin layers, like centimeter layers of ice cores, in the ice cores, could be annual rings. So this is one of the ways that atheists, I love how they throw in atheists to make sure that this is like atheist versus real Christians, claim that the Earth is millions of years old. Well, I don't think they would make a claim that it's millions of years old from 135,000 annual layers, although if there's 135,000 years of ice on top of Greenland and you still have to explain Greenland, obviously the world is pretty old, more than 6,000 years old. Right? So that's the kernel of the idea. Right? You point to the Lost Squadron, you point to a particular airplane that's 263 feet of ice above it, and you say like, well, how could all that ice accumulate over such a short period of time? Well, it obviously did because we know we have historical records, right, of the airplane landing there. And we've now found it. We've confirmed it's the same plane. There's this much ice. You divide by the number of years, you get 5.5 feet of year, 5.5 feet of ice per year accumulation. And then if you take that number, 5.5 feet, and you say, well, yeah, there's 20,000 feet of ice out there in central Greenland. And so it's possible that all that ice accumulated, since 4,500 years ago at the end of the global flood. In fact, he even goes on to say, and others will go on to say here, as we'll see, that after the flood, they would expect the amount of ice accumulation to be even greater because the world was really hot, right, from lots of volcanoes and plate tectonics and all that, creating a lot of heat. That would have vaporized a lot of water from the oceans. And it would have fallen on Greenland at an incredibly high rate, accumulating so much ice in Greenland over an even faster rate. But at least they can point to this particular real world example from just the last 50 years to show yes, ice accumulation can happen quite quickly. And here we got these atheists out there saying that that this represents hundreds of thousands of years, all this ice accumulation. Well, it can't be so. This is a very appealing argument to anyone who doesn't know the nuances of climate and snowfall and compaction and the thing we're going to talk about later, which is the actual way that we determine that those are annual layers. No one just looks at them and go oh, I'll just call those annual layers. No, there's a lot of science behind the calculation, the determination that these small layers represent individual years, not 50 events in a single year. Okay, but let's run through a couple of examples. I have to show you how is this being used by young Earth creationists. So this is one of the most popular descriptions, that's being shared on social media, right? The Lost Squadron. This one comes from Creation Ministries International. They're the main promoters of this idea, but we'll see that Ken Ham also talks about it too. Warplanes, which crashed in 1942, were found in 1988 under millions of years of ice. All right. The quotes always mean right, that's not really millions of years. But it also is a little bit of miscommunication and misinformation as well, because even atheists, right, we'll say non-young Earth creationists, I would prefer to say, would believe that this is not millions of years of ice, right? Hundreds of thousands of years of ice, potentially. All right, so there's two examples. Here we have a couple of YouTube videos from Creation Ministries International. Oh, notice the date on this. That's 2024, so this is just recently. Down here we have 7 months ago. What is the Lost Squadron and what does it tell us about glaciation, right? Here's the Lost Squadron, and that tells us that glaciers can form quickly. Why ice cores do not prove an old Earth. This is all about World War II planes as well. This was from just a few days ago. Right. And then we've got from more CMI, another video. This one was from 2023. Here we've got 2015, deeply buried missing planes challenge slow and gradual perceptions. Creation.com, Lost Squadron again. Here we have 2017. Do thick ice sheets really take thousands of years to form? Evolutionists and other long agers often say that the present is the key to the past. In that case, a 3,000 meter, and more than 9,000 foot long ice core, that's more than a mile, right? More than a mile thick. Imagine that much ice is piled up in the middle of Greenland. Would only represent some 2,000 years of accumulation. Right? How do they know that? Because at this other location in Greenland, there's been 263 feet in just 42 years. And therefore, that same rate of accumulation, if you extrapolate into the past, in other words, we're going to use the uniformitarian assumption, right? The uniformitarians say that all actions occur at the same pace over long. Actually, they don't say that, right? They say the basic mechanisms are uniform, but the pace might be different. Okay? Rainfall comes down at different amounts, in different years, right? It doesn't come down in a consistent rate from year to year. That's the same thing with snowfall. Snowfall also can change its rates, and snowfall can be different in one location than another. It's not a uniform rate across the face of the earth. Nonetheless, using that assumption that over time the rates are the same, you could say using this one location and extrapolating for another location, that could only be 2,000 years of accumulation. Now they're ignoring something in those ice layers. And I've already told you what that is. the volcanic ash layers. They don't mention this in the articles. They don't talk about the way that those ice cores are dated and the evidence of how long they took to accumulate. We'll get to that. I'm going to show you a couple of papers. Yeah, even if we allow for some compression of lower layers, but obviously as you pile up ice and it's going to compress, and actually the Greenland is actually flowing. The ice is flowing, right? It's accumulating in the middle, and then it's just kind of like the weight of it is actually squeezing it out toward the sides. I mean, that's how glaciers actually are sliding down, but actually also being squeezed down. There's ample time in the 4,000 or so years since Noah's day for the existing amounts of ice to have built up. See, the ice cores have been a challenge, a serious challenge to young Earth creationists, and they still are, as you're going to see, a huge challenge to the young Earth timeline, chronology of the Earth. And so they feel like they have to confront that. They have to have some explanation. And with the Lost Squadron, they feel like they've found a potential explanation, or at least I'll say that it's one that works well for a naive audience. All right, for which, most people are not aware of the scientific evidence surrounding ice cores. And so this particular example is a wonderful way to convince people that ice can accumulate really, really rapidly. And I would agree, it can in some locations. And if you have evidence that it accumulated rapidly, but other areas we have evidence that it didn't accumulate rapidly, right? And that's going to take a little explanation, which is why these little Facebook memes and so forth are so effective. I mean, young Earth creationists who share these absolutely love them. They think that they have the gotcha moment. Like this is the thing that absolutely just crushes the non-young Earth creationist, right? The old Earth creationist. It's like, we got you. The Lost Squadron is proof. It proves it. I hear that word all the time. The Lost Squadron proves that the Earth is young. Now, I'm going to show you that even some young Earth creationists would like, hold on, don't go that far. All right. We still think it's really helpful. We think it's a great piece of evidence, but it's not proof. And they'd be right to criticize other young Earth creationists for that. But they don't go far enough in their realization that this isn't the best of examples. Here we are at, Creation Ministries International again. Deeply buried missing planes, challenge slow and gradual preconceptions. This is from 1997. All right, so we started in 1992, 97, and they just it's like a constant dripping faucet, right? They just keep pumping this out as the same story over and over and over again. Now, on the Ark Encounter, that's Ken Ham's big replicate of the Noah's Ark. All right, this is a display that's found there. I believe this is the Ark Encounter, not the Creation Museum. I've been to both, and I forget sometimes which one I've seen at which place, what stuff I've seen at which place. The Lost Squadron, deep freeze, consistent with creation model, ice age model, ice model. So they're not saying proves a young Earth, but they're saying this is consistent. Fast accumulation of ice over a short period of time would be consistent with the young age model. Well, I can't argue with that. That would be consistent with the young age model. The fact that these aircraft were buried under more than 250 feet of snow and ice in less than 50 years reveals the unreliability of using so-called annual layers as a dating method. So again, they're calling into question the annual layer thing because the annual layer thing suggests that the ice is 100,000 years or more old. So therefore, this site is used to discount that other one. By the way, none of these articles talk about annual layers at this location. I've never seen young Earth creationists talk about, hey, you can count up the annual layers, and there are 42 layers in this ice, right? The annual layers really don't form that well in this part of Greenland. This is southern Greenland. It snows a lot there, a lot more than in the center of Greenland. And so, because you have moisture being brought in off of the ocean, and then most of that moisture is lost because the snow falls, and then it doesn't get to the central portion of the continent, kind of like what happens in a lot of other continents, right? And so when it snows that much, but it also gets a lot warmer in southern Greenland in the winter, so it's going to have some melting going on. And things get mixed up, and it's also moving. This whole thing is moving a lot. The weird thing is the Lost Squadron isn't actually at the same location it was before. This plane has moved several miles because it's under the ice is actually moving and sliding toward the coast. And so everything's getting kind of convoluted. And this is not very conducive to forming like clear annual rings, basically. But that's not true in central Greenland, where the annual rings form in a different way and are preserved for us. And we have the ability to count them and test that count because we can look at volcanic ash layers of known volcanoes when we know when they went off. So it's kind of like we know. Interest in Genesis and creationists want to say, like, hey, we know that there's 263 feet of ice that was deposited over a certain number of years, and therefore there was an average amount of ice placed there per year, right? And they'd be right, because we have a known event, right? To tag and locate our chronometer, right? To set our setting date. Well, we also know volcanoes like Vesuvius, right? We know when Vesuvius blew its top, right? Big time. And we can find the ash from Vesuvius in the layers of ice in Iceland or Greenland. And therefore we know that that is that year. That's when that happened. And then we can look at the amount of ice on top of it. And you can create, well, you could do the same thing they're doing here. You could create an average amount of ice that's been placed upon above that. And I'll tell you what, the average is a lot lower than 5.5 feet per year. Right? But that should be just as valid of a calculation as this Lost Squadron is. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So here we have Ken Ham, again, on the Ark encounter. He has a whole video display. There's a little room you can sit in and you watch this video talking about the Lost Squadron and how it points toward a young Earth view of the Ice Age, that all this ice was placed down, really not just over 4,000 years, but during the biblical Ice Age, which occurred just a few hundred years after the flood. Institute for Creation Research. So here we've got all three of the big young Earth creationist organizations that use this particular example of evidence for a young Earth. Plane found frozen under Greenland ice. This is from 2015 or something like that. Now, I'm pulling this one up because it does, this is many, many years into using this argument. And of course, people like myself have been pointing out some problems with that, namely the rate of snowfall being used with one location comparing to another. And so he does try to address that. So let's see how he does that. However, old earthers cried foul, arguing that creationists are making an invalid apples to oranges comparison. That is what I'm doing right here. This is an apples to oranges comparison. Yes, snowfall accumulates very rapidly in southeast Greenland today, where the World War II plains are located, but the deep ice cores have been assigned vast ages are from central Greenland. Now that tracks with what I've been saying, where snowfall rates are much lower, or are much slower. Hence, they claim Glacier Girl, the name of the first plane that's been brought up, doesn't tell us how long it would take ice in central Greenland to accumulate. It's true. I think that's true. The measuring the rate of ice accumulation at that point does not tell you directly what the ice accumulation is in central Greenland. All right, fair enough. All right, I appreciate Jake Hebert acknowledging this is a fair argument, but creationists are arguing that very warm post-flood, post-flood oceans resulted in dramatically higher sea surface evaporations. This put much more moisture in the atmosphere, resulting in precipitation rates that were generally higher than those today. All right, I explained that a moment ago, that after the flood, more precipitation, so therefore they're predicting there would be higher rates of ice accumulation. Right, well, this isn't testable though, because, or at least testable by the Glacier Girl, because the Lost Squadron was not during the flood. It wasn't during a high precipitation event, so they're not seeing that ice form. Right. So what they're doing is they are conjecturing, they're inferring something was different in the past. They're saying, like, this is kind of like an example of what would happen, what you would see if you had lots of accumulation really fast. And we're predicting the accumulation occurred really fast for most of the Greenland ice core, although today there's not as much snowfall. So the very upper layers, they might admit, in fact, I think they do admit somewhere, I'm sure at least one young Earth creationist I've read has admitted that there are annual rings at the very top layers of the Greenland ice core. It's kind of hard to deny when you can look at a Vesuvius volcano and you can see it in the ash layers, right? And then you can go up from there and you can count up, about 2,000 rings, all right, 2,000 annual layers of ice above it. It's like, Yeah, it's been about 2,000 years since Vesuvius, and there's 2,000 layers. All right, so maybe the last 2,000 years have been consistent, relatively consistent in terms of accumulation of ice at very slow, very low amounts. The snowfall rates we see today in southeast Greenland give us an inkling, right? See, they're just giving us a vision of what it might have been like 4,000 years ago for the entire continent of Greenland, where ice would accumulate in central Greenland during the Ice Age. Now, you know what I'm going to say to all this, and that is we have volcanic eruptions that are much older and go back well over 4,000 years. They're in the very, very, very top of the entire column of ice in central Greenland. And so if you have to go back 4,000 years and you're only down 15% down the way of the entire ice core, right? Then where are you going to fit this ice age? Like, when did all that other ice accumulate? Especially since the ice below it also has annual layers in it, right? And it has other volcanic eruptions, reported in it. So this is, but they don't tell their audience this. They don't tell how we estimate or how we test the annual layers with other pieces of evidence that tell us, that confirm that, yes, these are approximately annual rings. Not that every single ring is an annual ring. There can be unusual events in some years or some decades, which might have created a few extra rings or a few fewer rings. But for the most part, it looks pretty consistent that there are annual rings in that ice. So Glacier Girl is very much a valid young Earth argument. But what he's saying here is not what most people on social media say, right? Because they would just point to this and they'd say proof that all that ice accumulated fast. He has a more nuanced argument. He's not saying that this proves it. He's just saying it's an example of what could have happened. So therefore it is possible that all that ice accumulated, unless you start thinking about volcanic eruptions and some other ways of there are actually other ways of dating the cores as well, which all don't fit the young Earth profile. Okay, that brings me back to Answers in Genesis, because there is a current and this is what really stimulated me to make this video, is because Calvin Smith, one of the speakers at Answers in Genesis, or writers for Answers in Genesis, that is most prone to make some of the most direct and flamboyant claims. He has a current series of 3 articles on Answers in Genesis that have just been published about this, about how Glacier Girl, the Lost Squadron, proves that uniformitarianism is wrong, which, newsflash, yes, the uniformitarianism that he describes, that he defines, no geologist, accepts that form of uniformitarianism anymore. So he hasn't upended the apple cart at all. But he does write in his 3rd article, no silver bullet, but a much better explanation. Now, what does he mean by no silver bullet? He means young Earth creationists who are out there saying that this is proof that the entire ice column formed in just a few thousand years. That's going a little far. He's going to admit it, because he is trying to respond to people like me and incorporate some of their criticisms and find a way around it. So let's see, how does he do that? For some, it might seem like the evidentiary silver bullet, right? That this Glacier Girl thing is I'm just going to slap this in a social media post and say this is proof, and boom, I've this is my gotcha moment. Nobody can respond to this. So they pull it out to challenge evolution, or a long age believing Bible skeptic at the drop of a hat. Yes, he's right. That's what they're doing. But is this reality? Is there really any silver bullet in the origins debate? Now, he's going to use kind of a philosophical argument. There really aren't any true silver bullets, because there's always some way. There's always some way to re-explain the data. So therefore, you're never going to win a battle just based on evidence, because you can always reinterpret the evidence in the light of your own presuppositions and ideas, right? You see, some might say, what are long-age believers to do now that this damning evidence against their previous declarations has been overturned? Well, that's easy. They just change the parameters of your calculation to make the evidence fit. as this 2014 article on supposed state-of-the-art of ice core measuring does. The ability of the ice core to provide sub-annual information depends on the accumulation rate. Typically ranges from a few centimeters of ice per year in high elevation areas in the Antarctic to several meters at the coastlines of Greenland and on low latitude glaciers. And they're saying, look at these scientists. They're saying, like, in some places all they're going to do is just like, all they're going to do is just flip the table on you and say, like, well, but it could accumulate faster, it could accumulate slower, it could have, like, so, you're not going to win that argument. But of course, what it doesn't talk about is, what is the evidence that how confident are we that ice accumulates at a faster pace in southern Greenland than it does in central Greenland, or in Antarctica, or in some other place in Antarctica, it accumulates at a different rate? How confident are we? Part of it comes from actual observations, right? We've been taking measurements for many, many years at many different locations, and we can see from weather patterns and from snowfall and the amount that remains after the summer, we can see, like, here's the accumulation rate over the last 100 years. Now, what he's criticizing is uniformitarianism, as if, like, okay, well, that's the amount over the last 100 years, so therefore that's how it's been accumulating forever, right? That would be a wooden, simplistic idea of uniformitarianism, that therefore if ice has been accumulating at 2 centimeters per year over the last 100 years, then we would just extrapolate back and say that's the way it's always accumulated. But that's not what the people that study the ice cores in Greenland or Iceland or Antarctica do, right? They are looking for evidence. In fact, they're interested in, they want to know how much ice accumulation rates have changed over time, because most of us assume that it probably has, right? If the climate has changed during the ice age, we wouldn't expect the accumulation to be the same as during a non-ice age, right? And so can we find evidence in the ice core itself that there were hundreds of years or thousands of years of time in which the ice accumulated at a faster rate, and then at other times at a slower rate? So if you have no other evidence, you could just do the extrapolation thing from present data, but that that's just that would be a very broad estimate. You would actually want to go into the core and say to yourself, all right, I see that there are a series of layers that are like 2 centimeters thick for many, 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 many years. And then we have ones that are only 1 centimeter thick for a long period. And then we can infer from that, right, that the climate in this particular area had less moisture, right? There was less snowfall, over the period of several hundred years. And then can we correlate that with other locations in the world? And that's how we develop these models of climate change over time, that there were ice ages in the past, there were periods between the ice ages, interglacial periods, in which the climate was different in different locations on Earth. So that's, so Kevin is not acknowledging any of that. All he's just basically saying, oh, well, scientists are going to just say, because we can measure that it's different in different locations, all they have to do is just like make up their number for wherever they're at and say that, well, you're doing apples to oranges comparisons. He's apparently making a video series. So he's been posting a whole series of, like, he's making his own model of the P-38 Lightning Glacier Girl, and I guess to video for his video series is going to do on Lost Squadron. He's not going to say anything different than he just said in this written series, I'm sure. Yeah, it goes on and on and on, right? I could show you 100 different social media posts that have been presented as copies from the major young Earth creationist organizations, who all, as I've just shown you, all of them have used this argument in some fashion, all right, to point to create an explanation for this. The fact that if you go to different locations in Greenland, all right, and the southernmost one here is Dai. The Glacier Girl's down here, by the way, pretty far down in Greenland. The Lost Squadron down here. But there's been a number of locations that we've taken deep drill cores from and taken ice cores from, right? And all those are stored in some facility. And you go in now to the ice cores and you take little chunks out of them and study things like the air pockets, like the little bubbles that are in there, which contain air, right? And that air contains a certain amount of carbon dioxide and nitrogen and sulfur and other elements. And from that, you can determine things like how's the carbon dioxide changed, from the top of the core down to the bottom of the core. And there's a whole bunch of other measures you can do. And that also helps you infer past climate changes because of that. By the way, you wouldn't do that down there where Glacier Girl is because of the massive amount of ice that accumulates and the fact that it's all smearing down toward the coast and it's basically melting at the same time, right? So it's not a consistent capture of the climate over long periods of time, as opposed to deep Greenland, which is much, much, much colder, right? Isn't melting off in the middle of the summer. And so is basically storing information each year as it accumulates. And so this is just showing graphically. I like this particular figure graphically that here's the grip and the GISPE2 cores 3,000 meters, right? So this is over a mile thick of ice. This particular paper was interested in what's at the bottom of the core. They cored all the way down until they got to the ground below it. And then from the ground below it, they brought that up and looked at microfossils, and then they did DNA analysis, right? Extracted DNA. And they found, what types of organisms were there at the bottom, right? So this little DNA symbol means we've actually extracted DNA from that sediment that's below all that ice. And so what does that represent? Well, that represents the organisms that were alive when Greenland was green, right? when there was no ice on there, which it was at one point, a green land. And so we know the types of plants that were there because you can sequence bits and pieces of DNA and then compare it to all the organisms alive today to see what types of groups they're in. Not necessarily the species, but you can know like, hey, there was sunflowers there, or there was mammoths that were. So we know there's mammoths there. We can find different animal remains in the DNA and actual fossils of those. So really cool stuff. And it shows that, a very different world with a different mixture of types of organisms at that time. For young Earth creationists, I think that they would accept that there can be stuff underneath the ice, but they would have to say this is all stuff that must have like a mammoth at the bottom of a mile of ice, all right, that was living here before the ice accumulated. Well, where did it come from? Okay, well, there's elephants on the Ark. 2 elephants on the Ark got off, and then they had to diverge into the different kinds of elephants, which there's a lot of different species of elephants. Because you get your mammoths and mastodons, and you got your living elephants, but there's a bunch of other extinct ones. But anyway, you got your, let's say, mammoths, and at least a couple of them had to travel all the way from the Middle East all the way to Greenland, somehow get to Greenland, right? Which during an ice age, the water levels would have been lower, and it would have been possible to connect to there. But then there would have been ice covering the whole place. Of course, when there's ice covering the whole place, it's actually possible to walk over to Greenland, from, at one point from Iceland, but also from North America, obviously. But then if there's a lot of ice there, then how did they get underneath the ice? Right? So, but for young Earth creationists, they had to basically get off the Ark and they had to book it, man. They had to run as fast as they could and somehow swim to Greenland and then live in Greenland when it was green for 100 years after the flood. So first it was nothing but mud, and then it had to become green, and then animals had to come there and live there before the ice started to accumulate. But I just read you an argument from younger creationists. They want to say that all the ice was formed because right after the flood, the water was really warm and evaporated, and it fell as snow on Greenland and started to accumulate. So when was Greenland this green, lush land with animals living on it? Because it had to be before all the ice. I just don't know where that fits into the chronology. Right. I don't see any mention of this in the younger creationist literature. So they're trying to fix a problem. The problem is they need to explain why there's so much ice there. And by coming up with an explanation that it happened right after the flood, they then create another problem for themselves. All right. Which is, how do the organisms who lived underneath all that ice get there and live there? I mentioned this earlier. I just showing you the paper, Greenland ice core evidence of the 79 AD Vesuvius eruption. And then there's many, many, many other volcanic ash layers. Most of those are from like Iceland, because Iceland has a lot of volcanoes, and sometimes the ash moves east to west. A lot of Iceland volcanoes end up, the ash goes to Europe, right? So we have lots of ash layers in Europe that come from Iceland that we can date. Volcanism and the Greenland ice cores, the tephra record. There's many papers examining the tephra, that's volcanic ash, that's found in ice layers in the Greenland ice cores, but also comparing these to cores from other places in the world as well. All right, even going to the southern hemisphere and going to Antarctica and looking at ash layers there too. There are some ash layers that are found from volcanoes that are huge volcanoes that affected the entire world. And that's a way to actually have a common location, a common date. Like if you find that particular ash between two different ice cores, then you can say like, well, this is how much ice and snow fell at this location, but on the other side of Greenland, you find that ash layer deeper. Well, that means there was higher precipitation after that ash fell, right? So it's a really cool device for determining the amount of ice that's formed. Comparison of volcanic records over just the last 4,000 years. So let's forget about 100,000 years. Let's just look at 4,000 years. Greenland ice core from the WWII Greenland ice cores. The WWII is all the way down there, which is kind of not that far from the Lost Squadron. Although Lost Squadron is very close to the coast, and that's the issue. I mean, just going a little farther inland makes a big difference. And so for example, here we have we're looking at this core, and we have 1259 AD. Right, there's a large spike in a chemical that they're looking at that represents the fact that there's a lot of ash there, right? Which is very acid. So you end up with these little like acid spikes, and that tells you to look at that point. Then you can get a microscope out and you can look at the actual, glass shards that are there, because that's what volcanic ash generally is silica molecules. And then depending on the chemical composition of those, whatever that silica is combined with, right? Then you look at volcanic explosion. You go to volcanic sites and you look at ash that we know, like, okay, this ash came from this, volcano. Vesuvius, great example, right? Vesuvius, we know like the date that it had its large eruption, and we have actual ash layers we know came from that, from historical records. And it's like, here's the composition of that ash. And every volcano on Earth has a different chemical signature. There's going to be little differences between every volcano. There's a different mixture of material that comes up from the Earth and gets spewed forth under slightly different conditions, right? And hence, they're like fingerprints. And so I have a fingerprint of Vesuvius, and I can go and look at all the individual these are the major ash layers, all right? And so I can look at for 1105. At 1105, right, there's a major eruption of some sort somewhere, and I can identify where that volcano is. In 934 AD, there's a volcanic eruption, created a very large spike at that point. 1179. Now these are dated because we know of the volcanoes and we've matched them to the ash layers, and that's why those dates are there. But then you can go in and you can look at between these two dates, how many rings are there, right? How many annual layers are there? Because we count snowfall in the winter versus slight meltage, and then there's pollen layers because pollen's floating around in the spring or spring summer as laid down, but it's not laid down the summer. So that creates these little couplets, these little layers, which really are several centimeters thick. I mean, it's not like no snow falls in the middle of Greenland. There's still quite a bit of snow falls and compacts, and so you're still going to end up with a couple centimeters of ice. So these are pretty big rings, right? These aren't like tiny little varves in lakes or tree rings or something like that. These are pretty hefty rings, because we're down here at 250 meters, right? 250 meters is 700 or 800 feet, right? What was the Lost Squadron under? 263 feet. So this is like 2 or 3 times as deep. But now we're not just back 42 years, we're back 1,000 years, right? Right, we're 1,000 years ago instead of 42 years ago. So if you do the calculation from 1105 to present at 260 meters, then you're going to get something that's more on the order. I didn't do the calculation, should have done that, but it's going to be less than 5.5 feet a year for sure, right? It's going to be a much smaller amount, right? Say a couple inches, right, per year. That's been accumulating for 1,000 years, so you get a pretty good amount of stuff accumulated there. But the point here is that if you have 1105 and you have a marker at 1169, all right, that's 60 some year, right? 60, what's that? 64 years. And then you count up the rings between the two, and there's 64 rings. That gives you some confidence that those are annual rings, wouldn't it? Right? If you had a date for this particular spike and a date for this spike, and you had the actual like silica from the ash from those two locations, and you're like, these have fingerprint, I can fingerprint these to these two volcanic explosions, which I know happened at those years because I have historical references to those. All right, the younger creationists should be pretty happy with this. This is just like doing knowing about the bomber which landed on a particular date. Right. And then the bomber is at a particular location in the ice, and then then calculating the difference. All right. This is where we derive some confidence in the annual ring interpretation. And so you can go 934 to 1105, 1105, 1169, 1169 to 1179, and so forth. And this is just in one core. Then you go to another core and you can find the same spikes, because this, you're not going to have the ash fall in one place in Greenland. It's going to be kind of spread all over, right? But a different place in Greenland, what this ash layer at 1105, which is 260 meters deep, might be 220 meters deep somewhere else. And that tells you that at that location, there's been less accumulation over time. And guess what? The annual rings are skinnier, all right? The thinner. They don't accumulate at the same rate. So it's this type of data, all right, by doing more and more and more of this type of data. And there's people still all the time, because we have lots of spikes that we're like, we don't know. I don't know where, what volcano was this? We don't know, right? We can see there's a little ash layer there. And we chemically analyze it, but we haven't found the volcano at a particular location on Earth that represents that. There was just recently a paper, just like in the last week or so, like a new massive volcano that had been hunted for many years was finally identified. It was like somewhere up in Kamchatka or something in Russia. They finally found the spot, all right, where there's ash that matches that particular thing. And guess what? They date that particular ash there in Russia. And they're like, yep, it falls right in between, it would fall right in between the dates. Right. And so now we have a new explanation for another spike. All right. And so we're doing that and we're refining that model. So we're constantly like finding new information. And so far that information pretty much lines right up with the other information. That increases your confidence that for at least the last 2,000 years, ice has been accumulating at a pretty consistent rate for 2,000 years. All right, here's some more. Here's 2,000 years at this location. Here are a bunch of different dated items, and these are all from known volcanic eruptions. So we had the fingerprints from the two different locations that match. That tells us we know that that's where the surface of the Greenland ice was, right? And since then, there's been, and this one's looking at by year, not by depth. So we accumulate over time all these different ash layers. That's really all I wanted to do. It's not good enough to tell young Earth creationists that, there's simply more snow at the boundary of Greenland than there is in the center of Greenland. Because as you saw, they have an answer for that. They're going to conjecture. They're going to have a conjecture that after the flood, massive amounts of ice were laid down very, 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 very quickly. And then it's all slowed down to the present rate. And that's why we see less snowfall in central Greenland than we do on the coast. And so they're going to just say, well, but this points to the fact that lots of snow can accumulate. My comeback is, If you go down that core, and we just looked at the last 2,000 years, that last article actually goes back 4,000 years. And 4,000 years represents only the top 300 meters, right? Top 1,000 feet, but there's 9,000 or more feet of ice. And so at 4,000 years ago, you're still at, roughly in the top, you're more than the top third, right? 4,000 years, if you go back 4,000 years, and we can be pretty confident because we have volcanoes from those ages as well that are pretty well known. Right? And we've mapped those to the Greenland ice core. So what you're doing is you're still up here, right? You're still up here. And you're like, 4,000 years ago, you're up here. And the thing is, the actual annual rings get thinner as you go down, which makes sense. The whole thing is compacting, right? The whole thing's compacting and pushing everything out to the side. All right. So the top ones are, you got fluffy snow on the top. All right. It takes a while to get really compacted. And so it's not surprising that you'd have 4,000 years covers quite a bit of range. But as you go down, the same amount of depth added, another 100 meters is going to be a lot more years. And then 100 meters under that is going to be even more years represented because of how much thinner the annual rings get. Why do young Earth creationists, why would they expect to even see annual rings at all? Why do they see any rings? If the snow is just constantly falling all year long, how do you get those rings? Right? How do you get rings of like pollen, in discrete sections? If it all happened within just a few dozen years, how does pollen like rain like intermittently in one single year? Right? There's just dozens and dozens and dozens of problems with explaining the observations that have been made from the ice cores. Young Earth creationists tell their audience it's just about ice accumulation, right? How do you get a whole bunch of ice? They don't talk about the features of the ice column itself, right? Ash layers, pollen layers, the changes in carbon dioxide levels. I mean, there's other things too. And then why is there stuff underneath the ice representing a period of time of growth of organisms? That has to be incorporated into their model as well. So failure all around once you start to dive into the details. And young Earth creationist literature doesn't even inform their audience that these problems exist, right? They're just trying to solve the one big problem that they know that everyone can see, right? Everyone can see there's a lot of ice there. And so that's all they need to do is just try to explain why there's a whole big mound of ice and where did it come from. They don't think about explaining the features of that ice, the specific features of that ice. All right, that's critiquing creationism for today. I hope you got something out of that. There's so many interesting things about Greenland, and look for my other video on the mammoths that lived all the way up here. And I have a whole long explanation about why that's a challenge to young Earth creationists in terms of explaining the ecology of Greenland from long ago. All right. Thanks a lot. Thanks for listening. Subscribe, like. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.